Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. As you might imagine, I spent a lot of time in conversations about music. It comes with the job, and it's made me somewhat of a connoisseur when it comes to the tropes of musical discourse. Some of them are good, others are bad, but there's one that always annoys me a lot more than it probably should. I like to call it the Wiggly Air Fallacy after the old joke that music is just wiggly air. But I'm not here to complain about a joke. The thing that bothers me is that I also regularly see it presented as some deep, profound truth. Like, isn't it amazing that the mere vibration of air molecules can reduce you to tears? And yeah, that would be amazing. But they can't, because that's not what music is. I want to start by acknowledging that, at some level, this isn't entirely wrong. It's true to say that music is the vibration of air molecules in much the same way that it's true to say the United States Senate is made of atoms. It's technically correct. It's just not insightful. It's barely even meaningful. At its core, the phenomenon we call music is built out of sound waves, but in between you and those waves are so many layers of abstraction that calling the two things equivalent becomes almost a lie of omission. So instead of spending this whole video complaining about a relatively harmless thing people say sometimes, I'd like to demonstrate my point by running through a couple of those layers. Think of this as a quick tour of some of the most important filters you probably use to turn sound into music, or at least how I like to think about it. One of the simplest things you do is event identification. This represents your ability to take groups of waves and put them together to determine what happened. You never really hear a single vibration. I mean, you can, here's a single pulse of a sine wave, but when you listen to an actual note, you're hearing hundreds of those pulses every second. If you tried to process each one individually, it'd be complete chaos, so you don't. You hear it all as a single continuous pitch, or in some cases you hear a chord or a percussive attack. Point is, before you even start to engage with the sound waves, you've already bundled them up into higher level objects. This is also how you distinguish between different timbres, so like if I played the same note twice, you could probably tell me which of those came from a guitar. This works because most of the time instruments don't make sine waves. They make these complex patterns full of overtones or extra frequencies blended together to give the instrument its specific character. And so far, we haven't really left the sound waves yet. You could argue that all of this would show up on a spectrogram, so it still counts as wiggly air, and I'd have to concede that, yeah, that's reasonable. But where this gets really interesting is when there's more than one instrument. If I play this, can you tell which parts of it are coming from the drums and which are the bass? I bet you can. It's not that hard. But it's not like there's two separate sets of sound waves. It's all coming in at the same time from the same direction. There's nothing that clearly identifies each component of the wave as a drum sound or a bass sound, and yet I suspect it was still pretty easy for you to separate them. That wasn't in the vibrations. You did that. And sure, drums and bass have pretty different timbres, but even if it's just two guitars, it's still not that hard to tell them apart. Another important process here is pattern recognition. This is your ability to take the events you've identified and organize them into larger scale structures. These may be patterns of repetition, patterns of motion, or both, but to the best of my knowledge, every culture uses some sort of patterns in its music, and experiencing that music means engaging with those patterns. These can take lots of different shapes over different timescales. For example, when talking about Western popular music, theorists like to break our discussion of rhythmic patterns up into a couple different levels. The smallest of these is the subtactus, which is a very fancy way of saying smaller than a beat. This is the duration of individual attacks. Swing, for instance, occurs on the subtactus level. When you hear this, that bounciness comes from the subtle differences in length between eighth notes. Some are longer, others are shorter, and if you put them all together, you get swing. Above that is the tactus level, where we combine groups of subtactile notes into beats. Syncopation is a tactus thing. This melody has a beautiful push and pull to it that comes from the way he plays around with the beat, displacing some notes while keeping others aligned with the expected pulse. Together, the subtactus and tactus combine to create the rhythmic foreground, the thing we typically think of as rhythm. Above that are larger scale patterns like the meter, where we take groups of beats and combine them into bars. While the foreground levels allow for a lot of flexibility, it's less common to see too much experimentation at the metric level. Most songs stick to their original time signature. Not all of them, though. Here we see some clear metric variation, creating a sense of disruption and imbalance by combining a chorus in 4/4 with a riff in 7/8. And we can keep going. Hypermeter is where we take groups of bars and combine them into phrases. This tends to be even more rigid than meter, and hypermetric dissonance can be extremely jarring. Take, for instance, this transition. It's a metric thing in that we've switched from 4/4 to 3/4, but it's also a hypermeter thing. Throughout the song, the chorus phrases are repeated in groups of 4 complete bars, and cutting off the end of one phrase with the start of another violates that deeply ingrained expectation. The metric and hypermetric layers can be combined into the rhythmic midground, which we often refer to as just meter. We can keep going into the rhythmic background, combining phrases into sections, sections into songs, and so on, and the point I'm trying to make is that you do this pretty much automatically. When you listen to music, you're tracking patterns at all these different timescales simultaneously, and a lot of those patterns don't really show up in the sound waves. Even when they do, they're imprecise. It's extremely hard to feel small divisions of the beat with perfect accuracy, so the spacing at the subtactus level tends to be pretty inconsistent even with extremely talented musicians. In fact, many listeners prefer those fluctuations to the point where producers will add random inconsistencies to their program's drum parts to make them feel more human. As we go to higher levels, the structures become more rigid, but the things that define those structures become more abstract. We're no longer dealing with actual, measurable, specific sounds. Instead, we're looking at the alignment of theoretical pulses that no one is necessarily playing. Perhaps the most compelling evidence here is that we can recognize repeated vocal phrases with different lyrics. This just a small town girl repeats as this just a city boy. But in terms of acoustics, different lyrics means different vowels, and different vowels means different overtones. The physical vibrations created by the two lines are significantly different, but I suspect you had no problem identifying them as basically the same. So far though, we've still been dealing with sound. It may not be reducible to the vibrations of air molecules, but it's still stuff that you can hear. Things get even more abstract though when we start talking about outside context. This is where you take all the stuff you've been hearing and, well, put it into context. Now, that can mean a lot of things. One important part of this is stylistic and cultural context. We associate certain collections of sounds with certain genres and cultures, so if I played you this, you may never have heard that song before, but you could probably still tell me it was metal, right? The screamed vocals, the distorted chuggy guitar, and the rapid-fire kick drum all kinda give it away. We pick these things up through what's called enculturation. I've talked about this before, but it's really important here, so I'm gonna do it again. Basically, enculturation is the process of passively learning the norms of your own culture simply by existing within it. My favorite example of this is just like, who taught you how to sing happy birthday? If you grew up in the United States, odds are no one did. You just went to birthday parties, and by the time you were old enough to join in, you'd heard it so many times you already knew how it went. For a more adult example though, consider the backbeat. In modern popular music, it's extremely common to place the snare drum or another mid-range percussion sound on beats 2 and 4, or in some cases just on beat 3 depending on how you want to count the tempo. Point is, this pattern is the backbone of most of the rhythmic structures in rock, jazz, metal, hip-hop. If you're taste in music is anything like mine, you've heard it everywhere for probably your entire life. I don't even think about it, it's just what the snare drum does. In fact, every song I played you so far in this video includes some sort of backbeat. It's only when the snare pattern does something else that I start to notice. But the backbeat isn't universal. Lots of cultures don't do this. I mean, lots of cultures don't base their music primarily in 4/4 in the first place, but even the ones that do don't all agree that beats 2 and 4 should be accented like this. If we look back at, say, European classical music, a lot of that stuff just emphasizes beat 1, and the way they emphasize it is different too. In rock, the drum kit is the primary driving force behind the rhythm, which is what makes the backbeat snare so powerful, but classical music doesn't really have drum kits. They do have snares sometimes, but they don't have the same central position they do in rock. To someone living in 18th century Vienna, adding a backbeat to a Mozart sonata would just be confusing. The backbeat may feel obvious and natural, but like all musical gestures, its impact is heavily dependent on familiarity and context. Another part of this, though, is putting things in historical context, understanding not just the musical scene they came out of, but the world they were made to be a part of. I mentioned 18th century Vienna, and while it's true that the music of Mozart's time was very different from ours, that's not where the differences end. We have all sorts of cultural assumptions about what the classical period was like, only some of which are true, but all of those assumptions color our experience of Mozart's music. And so do its more recent associations. Back in the 90s, there was this whole thing about the Mozart effect, where listening to his music was supposed to make you and your children smarter. It turns out that whole thing was nonsense, but the idea was compelling enough that it stuck around anyway. To this day, one of the fastest ways to establish that a character in a movie is smart and classy is to show them listening to Mozart. And this isn't limited to extremely old music. Like, imagine for a second that you're a space alien with no knowledge of Earth's history or culture. Okay, now listen to this. just kinda sounds like noise, doesn't it? As a space alien, you don't have the context to understand it as anything meaningful. But here's some information that might help you solve this riddle. That clip was from Jimi Hendrix's performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock in 1969. In the United States, 1969 was full of protests about the Vietnam War after the Tet Offensive the previous year had made it clear to the American public that the war was far from over. Well, Woodstock wasn't explicitly a protest, it was part of the same hippie movement that was doing much of the protesting. Oh, and the line right before that clip was the part of the melody that anyone familiar with the Star-Spangled Banner would recognize as going with the lyrics and the rocket's red glare. Okay, now listen to it again. Does knowing all that give you any additional insight into the message behind a high, descending slide followed by, for lack of a better word, an explosion of distortion? I thought it might. And to be clear, while this performance is over 50 years old now, all of that context was readily available to everyone in the audience at the time. This can also include things you know about the artists themselves. My favorite example of this is Johnny Cash's cover of Hurt. The Nine Inch Nails version has this dark, haunting quality to it. Cash removes a lot of those elements from his arrangement, and yet personally, I find his much more impactful, in no small part because it's Johnny Cash. No disrespect to Trent Reznor, but taking these words, "You could have it all, my empire of dirt," and putting them in the mouth of one of modern music's greatest legends, long past his prime, in a song released less than a year before his death? It's devastating. And then there's personal context. You have lived a life, and in that life, things have happened. I assume. Those experiences will also shape your reaction to different kinds of music. Like in high school, my friend group had a running joke where we'd make up parodies of Kryptonite by Three Doors Down. And now, whenever I hear that song, I'm transported back to that time with those people. That's not in the sound waves, and it's something you probably don't have, unless we went to high school together, but for me at least, it's very real. I couldn't escape it if I wanted to. But these associations don't have to be quite that direct. Even if you've never heard a song before, it can resonate with you because it speaks to something within you. Love songs can remind you of people you've loved, protest songs can speak to injustices you've experienced, and narrative songs can remind you of similar situations from your own life. Whenever you listen to music, you're bringing a life's worth of baggage that helps you put those sounds into context. And lastly, we also have to consider narrative interpretation. This is where you take all those sounds and all that context and finally give them meaning. To borrow a concept from linguistics, this is where we do semantics. Music can convey all sorts of information, and some of that is linguistic. Many songs have lyrics, and even the ones that don't often have titles to at least give you some clue about how to hear it. And that's great. Words are a really effective tool for communicating specific ideas. There's no way to tell from this that the song is about someone named Jolene. But a lot of that information is musical. This could be something as simple as a sad song being written in a minor key, or it could be something more subtle like a slowly rising background line creating an uplifting sense of hope. These symbolic gestures come in all shapes and sizes, and they don't always behave the same way. This use of a B minor triad finally drank away her memory doesn't have the same impact as this one. You make me this, bring me up, bring me down. I swear those are the same chord. And this happens because the way we interpret the emotions of a piece of music is deeply multidimensional. Everything we hear impacts how we hear everything else. Musical meaning is so much more than the sum of its parts. And while some of those factors are acoustic, many of them aren't. Again, this comes back to context. Different genres use these tools differently, so what kinds of music we're used to and what kind of music we're listening to changes how we experience them. All that information we gathered in the context layer shapes the emotional landscape we perceive, and that, not the vibration of air molecules, is what allows music to affect us so deeply. You could take this clip and run it through every kind of acoustic analysis tool in the world, and none of them would tell you why it sounds so sad. I should note here that while I called this narrative, I don't mean to imply that every song has, like, a 3-act plot structure. Sometimes there is a clear storyline, but often it's just a vibe. That's honestly one of the best things about using music to tell stories. The capacity for music to convey raw sentiment without fixed meaning allows you to create a narrative journey while still letting your listener personalize their own experience, filling in the details that that best fit their own life. That's why love songs so rarely mention the lover's name. And it doesn't even have to be a journey, it can just sit in one emotional state forever. It may be pushing the definition a bit to call that a narrative, but I think in many ways one could argue that narrative is just refined emotion anyway, so I think it's probably fine. Alright, what's the point of all this? Should you stop saying that music is wiggly air? No, it's fine. It's a good joke. But when it comes to serious philosophical discussions about art, it concerns me when music is reduced to sound waves because it strips it of so much of what makes it beautiful. Music is a personal, cultural phenomenon that uses an unspoken shared vocabulary of sounds and gestures to communicate rich, complex stories and ideas with a level of emotional precision that mere language can't touch. My dishwasher makes sound waves. My car makes sound waves. Sound waves are everywhere. But they're not music. Music is experience, music is communication, music is culture, and most of all, music is art. Air molecules can't touch that. And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Kevin Wilamowski, and Grant Aldonas. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.